Welcome to Unit 9 on the atmosphere. So now that we've talked about the rocks that make up the Earth and a lot of the ecosystems and living creatures that live on the Earth, we're going to move slowly upward from the surface and into the air that surrounds the Earth, known as the atmosphere. To start off, we're going to look at what the atmosphere is made out of. All right, the atmosphere is a mixture of gases. So everything we're going to be talking about is in its gaseous state. And a good 99.9% of the atmosphere is made up from just three elements. And those elements are nitrogen, oxygen, and argon. Now, nitrogen and oxygen, we've talked about little bits here and there before, and you've heard of before. Argon you might not know so much about. It is one of the noble gases. And it doesn't do a whole lot. It's an inert gas. It's not very reactive at all, highly unreactive. And we, put some of it in little tubes and send electricity through it to make certain neon lights. After we get through these elements, the nitrogen, the oxygen, and the atmosphere, and the argon in the atmosphere, we get to some of the more abundant compounds, and the two most abundant compounds are carbon dioxide, CO2, and water vapor, H2O. And in fact, the water vapor, even though it's not one of the most abundant things in the atmosphere, it's one of the more abundant compounds, but compared to the amount of oxygen or nitrogen, it's really, really little. We're going to spend the whole next unit talking about that water in the atmosphere and what it means for this Earth. But that's for a different time. And besides having these elements and these compounds, there are also larger particles, solid particles floating around the atmosphere, mostly dust and pollen. And we'll talk about those a little bit more a little later in this lecture as well. Let's start with the nitrogen. The nitrogen in the atmosphere is the most abundant element in the atmosphere. Nitrogen is one of the 7 diatomic elements, one of the 7 elements that occurs in nature bonded to another atom of itself. So a lot of times you'll see nitrogen written N2, a lot like you see oxygen written O2. And it makes about 78% of the atmosphere, maintained through the nitrogen cycle, which we all kind of remember if we think back. And the big way nitrogen is taken out of the atmosphere and put into the part of the nitrogen cycle where plants and animals can use it, those were those nitrogen-fixing bacteria that live in the roots of legumes like bean plants and such. And then as things die, nitrogen-releasing bacteria release nitrogen back into the atmosphere, where, once again, it cannot be used. The second most abundant element in the atmosphere is oxygen, and I'm pretty sure you're a little more familiar with oxygen than you are even with nitrogen because you use it every day. You need it to live. You need it for your cells need it for cellular respiration, which makes the energy your entire body can then use to do all of its daily functions. So about a fifth of Earth's atmosphere, or 21%, is made up of oxygen. All this oxygen comes from land and ocean plants and algae through photosynthesis. Alright, it is a waste product of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis takes in carbon dioxide and water from the air, takes in that carbon dioxide and water, uses sunlight to convert the carbon dioxide into glucose, a 6-carbon molecule of sugar. So it takes 6 carbon dioxides, puts them together, and makes a sugar. And then all the leftover oxygen is released, which then gets used by everything living in cellular respiration. But really, oxygen's more like a byproduct, a waste product. The big part of photosynthesis is making the glucose, not making the oxygen. And then animals, bacteria, plants take out the oxygen and release it, or from the air. They remove the oxygen and perform cellular respiration. Now, as I said earlier, the two main compounds in the atmosphere are water and carbon dioxide. So water exists in the atmosphere as an invisible gas that we call water vapor. It comes from oceans, lakes, streams, rivers, soil. Any body of water it evaporates from. Even plants and animals give it off in a process called transpiration. Well, for the plants and animals, and then evaporation for standing bodies of water. And either way, it enters the atmosphere. It doesn't really matter. It gets to the atmosphere by evaporation and transpiration. And as I said, next unit we'll focus more on the water in the atmosphere, and we'll hit up that water cycle that I'm sure you guys probably remember from 7th grade. And then the water gets removed from the atmosphere through condensation, which is it going from a gas to a liquid, and gets removed also by the process of precipitation, which is a form of water falling from the sky. And we'll talk about both of those as we go on in this unit and next unit as well. Ozone is another one of these trace gases that we find up in the air. And what ozone does, ozone's an interesting little compound. It's made up of 3 oxygen atoms. So normal oxygen in the atmosphere is O2. Oxygen, like nitrogen, is one of those diatomic elements that likes to be combined with itself. Well, in certain places up in the atmosphere, the oxygen combines with 2 other oxygen atoms to make this molecule of ozone, and it's found in the upper atmosphere, and we get a big layer of it, and that's called the ozone layer. And the ozone layer is really neat. The ozone has this unique property of absorbing UV radiation, or ultraviolet light, which can be really bad for us. I mean, we get a little bit of it, some of it makes it through. It's part of the reason that our skin tans in the summertime if we stay out in the sun and get sunburn, that kind of stuff. But without the ozone layer, living organisms would be severely damaged. Really high numbers of UV rays, ultraviolet rays, can change even DNA and create different forms of mutated DNA, mutated cells, and even some cancers. Now, over the last 100 years or so, we've been doing a bunch of activities that have started to damage the ozone layer, but we've also started to figure out ways to slow that down in the last 10 or 15 years, and the ozone layer depletion is not as big of a problem now as it was about 15 years ago when I was in high school. So we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about climate change and some of the harmful activities we're doing to the atmosphere later on. And then there are these funny little things called particulates, which sounds like a word I made up, but I did not. And a particulate is any small solid particle, pretty much. We're talking about volcanic ash, volcanic dust, ash from fires. Could even be little tiny microscopic organisms, particles from soil lifted by winds after like a tornado or something, pollens, really tiny broken pieces of meteors that have vaporized in the upper atmosphere. And so these can float around up in the air and get blown around by the wind and everything. And if they're small enough, they can stay up there for months or years. The really tiny ones can be suspended for months or years. The heavier ones fall to the ground kind of quick. And so that's everything that is in the atmosphere. Now, if we go look at the atmosphere more in depth, we find out that the atmosphere is divided into different layers. And the layers are categorized by what's happening to the temperature. You would think that just as you went up the atmosphere, it would get colder and colder and colder to end up in space where it was super cold. That kind of makes sense, but that's really not what happens. We're going to go through that. So there's temperature changes as the altitude changes, and the altitude is the height. So the higher up you go, the higher the altitude is. And then we see temperature changes. And we see certain patterns of temperature changes. And it's these patterns of temperature changes that cause us to classify the 4 layers of the atmosphere. And these temperature differences are caused by the solar energy, the energy from the sun that gets absorbed as it goes through the atmosphere. And as I said a little bit before, there are 4 main layers that are based on these differences of temperature. And here is a graph of the atmosphere. And here's altitude. Right? It's not to scale, it's in kilometers. I mean, we got 10, 20, 30, 40. And then it jumps from 100 to 500. There are 4 layers of the atmosphere. There's the troposphere, which is the one we live in, and we're going to hit on each one of these on its own. There's the stratosphere, where the ozone layer is a part of the stratosphere. There's the mesosphere, which is where meteorites burn up in the atmosphere, right here. Meteorites get burned up here, so when we see meteor showers, these are what we're actually seeing. And then the outermost layer is the thermosphere, which is also where things like the aurora borealis and auroras can occur. So starting with the lowest one, the one we live in, and that is the troposphere. Alright, troposphere is the lowest layer of the atmosphere. And this is the reason we think that temperature goes down as you get higher, because in the troposphere, temperature drops at a constant rate as the altitude goes up. So as you go higher on a mountain, temperature goes down. So right here, temperature drops as altitude goes up. And this is where weather exists. Alright? All weather occurs in the troposphere. And it's where all life is in this troposphere. The second layer going up is the stratosphere. Alright, and it's the second layer up there. It's between the troposphere and the mesosphere. Right? Okay, but as you're going up, there's no sign that all of a sudden says, welcome to the stratosphere or welcome to the mesosphere. So, just kind of look at that picture a few slides back and kind of figure out how many kilometers up it is. But the weird thing about the stratosphere is the temperature increases in the stratosphere as one continues to go up. Alright? And it also contains the ozone layer. But again, big thing, the temperature goes up as the altitude goes up. So you get higher, you get warmer. And the whole reason for this temperature increase is the interaction of solar radiation by ozone. Solar radiation by the ozone there, that causes a reaction then that releases heat energy and warms the air in that area. The mesosphere is the coldest layer of the atmosphere. It's the third one. All right. Now we talked about a mesosphere under the ground, called the mesosphere. We said it was named that way to be called the middle sphere. Well, it's not the middle sphere here. It's number 3 of 4, so it's one of the spheres in the middle. Why we use the same name, I have no idea. I think scientists that came up with it just really wanted to mess with you guys and make you remember the same name twice to mean 2 totally different things. But that's just my personal opinion, and I don't know if that's what they did on purpose. All I know is that that's what it's named, and that's what I have to teach you is the real name. I can't just call it like the Guadagna sphere, you know. I don't think that would catch on. And then if you were talking to like a real person that knew what they were talking about, and you're like, yeah, Guadagna sphere. It's between the stratosphere and the thermosphere, and temperature decreases, altitude increases. That's Guadagna sphere. They would think you were nutso. So it's the mesosphere between stratosphere and thermosphere, and the temperature goes down again as the altitude goes up, and it's the coldest layer. Kind of important stuff to know there about that mesosphere. The final sphere is the thermosphere. The thermosphere is the uppermost layer. It borders between empty space and the atmosphere of the Earth. And again, the temperature increases as altitude increases. And this has to do with the interaction of solar radiation and some of the particles that are up there. Now, there are a lot fewer particles in the thermosphere than in the spheres below it, and part of the second lecture is talking about air pressure, which is looking at how many particles there are in a certain area. We'll get into all that tomorrow. Really cool thing about the thermosphere, besides the temperature going up and the altitude going up together again, just like you had in the stratosphere, it also includes this region called the ionosphere, which is 80 to 400 kilometers above the Earth, above Earth's surface, above sea level. And it's called the ionosphere, and this is the lower region, the thermosphere. And the neat thing about the ionosphere, it's a bunch of ions, a bunch of charged atoms, kind of floating around together up in this part of the atmosphere. And charged atoms can do weird things with electromagnetic radiation, or waves, electromagnetic waves like light waves and everything. And the one really cool thing is AM radio waves are a really low energy form of electromagnetic radiation, and they can bounce off this ionosphere. And so sometimes you can get a radio station from really far away on the AM radio coming in crystal clear in the area. When I lived down in Baltimore, I was able to get AM radio from Buffalo on certain nights if it was clear enough and cold enough that the radio waves would bounce off the ionosphere and back to the Earth and into my car in Baltimore, which is a good 7 hours away from Buffalo. And even sometimes, if the conditions have to be right, it's not consistent. But even some other times, you can get radio stations from other countries. I've heard of people getting AM radio stations from Quebec or from Russia on certain nights. So it's kind of neat little thing about the ionosphere. And the second neat little thing about the ionosphere is that the way it interacts with solar radiation, as it interacts with the UV radiation and other radiation from the sun, some of these charged particles gain some energy and re-release it as different colors of lights, and these are called the auroras. So the northern lights, the aurora borealis, that is the interaction of radiation from the sun with the ions in the ionosphere, or the lower thermosphere. And that is it for this unit. Or not this unit. That is it for this lecture. So I hope you had a somewhat enjoyable time learning about the layers of the atmosphere and the composition of the atmosphere. And we'll move on talking about atmospheric pressure next time. Have a good night and bring any questions you have to class.